And we're recording. So it's very cool that the community is coalescing and putting up different ideas ancillary to not just talks, but also ancillary to talks, things related to interviewing and to resumes and to things that are useful and important and relevant b'zman hazeh. Don't hesitate to reach out to any of the organizers with your ideas. In the meantime, happy to introduce Izzy Davidowitz.
Thank you very much. So thank you, David. And I know I have I worked with Rocheli and Avram David, so thank you, you two, and whoever else helps organize these talks. Very helpful and enjoyable. So good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. The title for tonight's talk is Getting Started with Speed and Performance. And I want to touch on three things, hopefully. Number one would be, what is a metric that you should be looking at today? It's 2020, and these things constantly shift and change and rotate. And what's something you should be looking at to understand if you're providing an optimal experience to your users? The next step would be to understand, how's your site actually doing? So how do we understand whether our site's doing good, bad, etc.? And number three is, how do you then focus on improvements? So that's the title for tonight's talk, and hopefully that's what we'll cover. Moving along. So my name is Izzy Davidowitz. I was the manager of the mobile team for a number of years. B&H has a separate, well, I should say I work at B&H Photo. We are one of the largest, or the largest electronics retailer in the world. We have a store in Manhattan. We have a mobile site, a desktop site, not responsive, separate code based on mobile site, and we have native apps as well. And for a number of years, I managed the mobile teams. That was everything from UX through QA. We had our own little team. And as a byproduct of that, with time came up the topic of speed and performance, and that's obviously much more relevant to mobile than it is to desktop. So there's always, the really geeky front-end engineer that geeks out and works on speed and performance, and they devote some of their time to it. But with time, that sort of, falls to the side. And unless there's somebody actively focusing on it, it does not get looked at often, and things can deteriorate, and certainly they're not improved. So I've actually moved on. I now lead the QA team, but one of the parts that I wanted to keep with me was work on speed and performance. It's something I enjoy and really like working on. I wish I had even more time to work on it, but that's what I do today. My Twitter is @Davidowitz, and there, if anyone's on Twitter and gets their news from there every morning or whatever it is, I have a public list of people who tweet and share a lot about speed and performance, and you're welcome to go there and take a look at that. So let's just jump right in and start looking at metrics. What are metrics that we can look at? What are metrics that would explain how our site's doing? And we can then circle back and say, okay, are these metrics relevant to us, and how do we improve these metrics? But what are these numbers? What are these points on our site that we should be looking at? Now, this, by the way, applies to anyone that has any sort of software. This can be a SaaS that you're selling users, maybe some payroll SaaS, a blog, photo sharing, and obviously e-commerce. It's really relevant to any piece of software that users are using. So this is a fairly common or famous graph for its navigation timing. This is from Mozilla. I think there's another one or two out there that are very similar. And this explains the process of the browser from what happens from when a URL goes into the browser, how it connects, it makes the connection to the server, gets the data from the server, responds back, the browser parses what it gets back, and then displays it on the screen. And this is not all specifically relevant to tonight, but certainly an image or a graph that people should be familiar with. And if you want to have a deeper understanding of how browsers work, really all the way down to the CPU level, Google has a fantastic, and we're going to hear Google's name a lot tonight, by the way. So they have a fantastic 4-part series where they really drill down and explain every little bit. It's a really, really enjoyable read, long read. It's a 4-part series, I think, 4, maybe 5. Each one is at least a 20-minute read. So it's really long and very enjoyable, very educational. So now back to this navigation timing. So back in the day, this is the navigation timing that was very common, and maybe let's talk 5, 7, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, something like that. And you'd have these metrics at the end here, which were HTML related. You'd have DOM content loaded, you'd have document complete, and you have on load. And these were the things people looked at, and primarily, if you had a fairly simple site with some HTML and it came in, these were relevant. You can say, okay, well, my HTML on load was at, 3 seconds, and we're going to try to improve it to 2.5 maybe. And that's the way people looked at speed and performance. And there was two problems that sort of came up as time went on. Number one is these are technical numbers. So if you want to sell your CEO or maybe product owner or something like that, business owner on investing and working on speed and performance, this is a technical number. It's not something they would understand. It just says on load. They don't really know what that means. And people were struggling with that concept. The other thing that came up was we started having a lot more JavaScript on sites. Sites weren't so simple anymore. So you can have your HTML come in and load, but then there's all sorts of stuff going on the page after that. Number one, they're eating up CPU. And number two, the site's maybe not even usable at that point. So these numbers were becoming obsolete. So at this point, we got to bring Google into this big time. And whether we like them, whether we hate them, and there's a lot to discuss. It's probably a talk just on itself, what Google's involvement in this could and should be or is. They've certainly invested a tremendous amount over the past few years and resources and people working on it and making information public and blog posts. And their latest site is web.dev, and they have a wealth of information there. And again, we can discuss if, they have the right to say that if you have a fast site, you get bumped up on top of their search results. We can discuss things like AMP, which B&H does do. We can discuss PWA, which we're also working on. These are all great conversations. But the bottom line is they're an important part of this whole speed and performance conversation, and it's not fair to ignore them. One of the biggest things, and this comes up again and again, and I think they're trying to make this point, and they've certainly made it to us in private, is that these numbers are recommendations. These numbers are, or metrics, or parts of the site, parts of the load sequence of your site are things that you should look at, things that are important to users. It's not like we're saying this is what it has to be. We are highly recommending and suggesting them, and we're doing that for a reason. So again, going with Google is also a challenge because what happens is they change these. So the three we're going to look at today are Web Vitals, they call it. And this came out less than a month ago. And before, going back a year or 2 years, they had a different set of metrics that they recommended people work on. So if you're going to just go with the Google model and say, I'm going to work on what they recommend, you're going to get stuck with this. And they actually, now when they came out with Vitals, they specifically said that we have the right to change this in a year. So in a year from now, we're going to revisit and see if this is still relevant, and we may come up with a new set of metrics and new things that people should focus on. So that's a downside of just looking at Google on its own. Another downside is that it may not be relevant to you. For example, up until this Web Vitals, I forget which metric it was, but one of them was on a 3G network. So they said, we recommend that you have maybe time to first byte or whatever it was, first paint on a 3G network should be this and this time. And for us, we do a bulk or a lot of our sales in the US, and we sell high-end electronics. So you can imagine we're not a maybe rideshare or payment sharing service in India. That's a very, very different set of users. So it's not necessarily true that what Google recommends is applicable to you. But again, it's just trying to think of the right word here. It's maybe not a North Star. It's a recommendation of what you should be looking at. And certainly before Google, you have large companies, and they've blogged about this. Amazon, Walmart, eBay have not used the straight, on load. They've come up with their own way of measuring site speed and performance. But for most smaller sites, that was almost impossible. It really took a lot of work to record those metrics, log them, and then sort of go back and try to improve them. So the three we have from Google, and these are the three Web Vitals. The first one is largest contentful paint. And they've played with contentful paint, and we'll discuss it a little bit more in a few slides. But for now, what they're saying is that the largest piece of content within the viewport, and that updates as more content comes in, should be for 75% of your fastest users. So you take your users and you take the top 75%, they should get that largest contentful paint within 2.5 seconds. And that's what they're recommending. And again, if you go to web.dev/vitals, they go in and explain scientifically why they came up with these numbers and these metrics. It's really interesting. But this is pretty much what they're recommending today. And that's an important metric. That's something to realize. Again, regardless of the type of site you have, that piece of content that's most relevant to the user, that's the biggest on the page, should be there faster than 2.5 seconds for most of your users. The next metric that they stress on and think is important is first input delay. And that's when a user taps on something, not a scroll, but they actually tap sort of wanting results, there should be less than 100 millisecond delay. Again, for the fastest 75% of your users. And the last metric they share is cumulative layout shift. And they're pretty much taking the amount of information that's on your page that shifts and the amount that it does shift, the amount of pixels it moves. And this is very common today. You have many sites have COVID messages, for example, and you come into a site, the site loads, and then a half a second later, the whole site drops down because there's a COVID message that's there. And this, they feel, is a really bad user experience. And they're telling you they have a way of calculating, again, the amount of content that moved and how much it moved, and they're going to rank you based on that. So again, these are the three primary metrics. It's just here to give you an idea of the concept that metrics and speed and performance is really another function of user experience. It's another part of UX. You try having a pretty site so user enjoy coming to your site and shopping and they're happy with it. This is just another way of doing that. Another way of looking at metrics, and this is not these three from Google. Again, a very similar perspective. It's pretty much saying you have first paint, so that's when there's something loading on the screen. Maybe you have a logo or a header and footer. Not useful to the user, but if they understand that content is going to come, the site has started loading, and here's a little bit of information. You can then track your first meaningful paint. So meaningful is something that's useful to the user. If maybe you're on an e-commerce site on a product detail page, you get a title and you get a price. So the page hasn't loaded, but there's meaningful information there. The next level would be main content loaded. So you have your title, your image, and your price, for example. And the fourth level, the fourth point or metric to look out for is interactive. When's the site actually interactive? It means pretty much the hard to calculate, but that's another point you should be aware of. And again, to just stress one more time, this is really just a guide. It's just a way to make your users happy. And again, everyone's got to look at this from their own site and their own users. Another example is they're saying 75p. They're saying take your 75% of fastest users. We try to look at 85. We feel 75 is not broad enough. We want to include another 10% in that. And then the last 15 you leave over, and you can look at that as a separate conversation, understanding what's going on there. Another recent conversation that actually came up with speed and performance was, this wasn't us, somebody else had this question. So what they were doing is font display swap. So they would have default fonts come in, and this was from a user perspective, right? They wanted to give people a good user experience. They'd have a font that would come in, and then maybe a second and a half later, it would swap out with their downloaded font, right? And that was, again, to give the user a good experience. Google was looking at that and saying, well, our new metric, cumulative layout shift, your site is shifting. So we don't think that's a good user experience. So which one do you do? Do you do A or do you do B? And there's no right answer. The idea really is just focus on the user and try to give them the best experience possible. Okay. The next thing that comes up is, should I bother with all of this? This is a lot of work. It's resources, it's time, it's money. Do I care? Why does anyone even care about any of this stuff? So in addition to just being good user experience, there's a few different points to keep in mind. There's SEO. And again, Google doesn't usually say these things, but they've actually came out in their webmaster blog and said specifically that Web Vital metrics will impact SEO ranking. So that's not something they typically do, but they shared that. And that's important for your SEO, and almost every e-commerce or public site out there relies on SEO. So this is important for SEO. If you've had increased mobile traffic, so as time goes on, your mobile traffic is getting more and more. Obviously, speed and performance is super relevant to mobile users. It's probably something you should take a look at. You can throttle your network. Chrome DevTools has two throttling options. You can throttle network, which is just in the network tab. And then there's also, you can throttle your CPU, which is in the performance tab. And doing that really gives you a perspective of what somebody on a phone would experience versus you on this, few $1,000 MacBook plugged into the internet. Very, very different experiences. And Facebook would have, I think it was 1 day a week or 1 day a month, where they take the company Wi-Fi and throttle it, so people using Facebook on their phones would get an idea of what this was like for real users. Look at analytics. Definitely look at analytics and see what kind of devices are people visiting your site. Again, are you getting Android versus iOS? What location are they visiting your site from? So the important things to know before you make this investment. Think with Google is a very, very useful site to get started. You can put your site in there. It'll give you some really great feedback about your performance. You can put in competitor sites, and it'll give you back feedback about you versus your competitors. It's getting that information from what's called CRUX, C-U-R-X, Chrome User Experience Report. And this is when you have Chrome and download it, I guess. They ask you if you want to opt in to share information with them. For people that do opt in, they are recording data about the sites that people visit. So you can just go right now, Google Crux, and put your site, and it'll give you a lot of these metrics and the numbers that you rank on from actual users to your site. Again, it's only Chrome, and it's only a certain percent of the users, but that's what they're going to share with you, and that's a very handy site to get started with. And then the last point is, if your site is image heavy, if you have a site that's delivering a lot of images, probably worth taking a look and seeing where you can optimize. Images are always super, super heavy to render. They eat the battery, they eat the CPU, they heat up the phones. Really, really a lot of improvement usually possible on those type of sites. And lastly, I think in the last slide I have some links. There's a site that has done PWA case studies. So it's taken sites that have switched over to PWA, which we're not going to discuss, but in and of itself, it's considered a speed and performance enhancement. Many times by using service workers, and they share there a lot of sites that have made this improvement and the percentage increase that they've seen, whether in revenue, whether in conversion. One last thing I just want to say here, and that is that fast, I think today really equals trust. So the same way you come to some sites, or maybe if you go to a site and it's not secure, it's not HTTPS, and you're like, yeah, I'm getting out of here. They don't, I don't trust them. Speed has taken on something like that. If you go to a site and it loads really fast, and obviously it looks good as well, you gain a lot of brownie points with users. They value that. They understand that you're investing in making that happen, and this is not just a byproduct of something else, and it's really important to you. So you decide to get into this, and you're like, okay, what's the next step? So there's two ways to measure speed and performance. There's what's called synthetic testing, and that's lab testing. So that's pretty much, you have one computer and you plug in your URL in there, and you can sometimes tell it what parameters you want to use. Maybe you want to set in a certain location, or if you want to do it with throttle your network, and it'll give you back numbers. It can give you back pretty much a waterfall of what happened when you called the site, the sequence of events of all the network calls that were made and what time they came back. So for synthetic testing, it's very good for proactive. So for example, if you have migrations, and we do this, every time you migrate, it kicks off a set of tests, and you record these, and with time, you want to be able to make sure that nothing has changed with a migration. Usually when this happens, you can get back video recordings of the session, so you can actually match your video, because for many parts of a site loading or a page loading, there is no single metric that will correlate to that happening. So when you have that video, and you can say, okay, so looking at the video, and we'll have an example later, at 2.5 seconds, let me now look at the waterfall chart and say 2.5 seconds, what came in, what piece of content finished downloading, and you can understand how your site's loading, what the process is. Some examples are DevTools, Chrome DevTools. Obviously, they have their waterfall there. And then there's also Lighthouse. Lighthouse is another Google product, primarily meant for speed and performance. You can get it as a node module. You can also go to the audits or performance tab in Chrome, I forget, and run your Lighthouse report. Lighthouse report will give you fantastic suggestions on how you can improve your site. Lighthouse includes everything from accessibility, so that's like handicap visibility on your site. It includes SEO, it includes performance, and it includes PWA, and maybe one other thing I forget. And it breaks it down, groups it up really, really nicely. So just DevTools on its own, along with Lighthouse, gives you a wealth of information. There's a web URL you can go to for Lighthouse and plug your website in there, and it'll return the same thing to you. All that really useful information, again, with very, very detailed recommendations. Again, not always relevant, but things that you should look through. And SpeedCurve is a paid service that will pretty much run these tests on whatever basis you want. The next type of testing you have is called RUM, and that's real user measurement. And that's actually some JavaScript that's on your site, and that runs and sends back all these metrics from actual users. And you can then look through that and understand what's going on your site. So it's passive. It always sits there. It always collects the information. And if you look at that every day, every morning, or whatever it is, you get an idea of if anything's odd, anything changed, anything jumped today that shouldn't be where it is. And you have, with doing RUM, the benefit of this, obviously, and it's expensive. MPulse is from Akamai. Their SpeedCurve has a RUM as well, and then there's Catchpoint. Those are three big ones. There's definitely a couple more. But what happens is you can look at all this data coming back, and you can filter now by location. So I say I want to compare US to Europe, and now look at my time to first byte, for example. Is there a difference there? And then you go dig in, you say, why is there a difference? So that's when you go back to your synthetic lab testing, and you'll set a test from Europe and you'll set a test from the US, and you'll be able to really break down into the nitty-gritty and understand what the difference is and why things are being served differently. You can break down your RUM data by OS, you can break it down by network conditions, really by device, and that gives you a wealth of information about how your site's functioning in the real world. Next thing that's really popular and extremely important for anyone working on speed and performance is webpagetest.org. This was started way back in 2008 by Patrick Meenan. I think he's at Google or Facebook now. It's free, it's open source. I'm just trying to speed up a little bit. It's getting late. Pretty much the way this works is you go to their site, you put in your URL, and you choose a device and a location. And that image is actually from his basement where he has the mobile devices sitting there, or at least it used to be. And it runs it for you. And what comes back, we'll have in a couple of screens, is a really nice waterfall chart. And that we'll get to that in a minute, but it's just important that you know this exists and certainly worth a visit. And I'll just show you a couple of really cool, neat features that they have. One of them is if you browse over to the third tab, and I hope this is people can see this, there's visual comparison. You can pretty much just put in different URLs or different competitors. You can put in, if you have different versions of your page that you can set with the URL parameter, you can do that. You give them a name, you run it, and then pretty much you can get this back. And again, hard to see, but this is 4 websites. Each row is a different website. On the top, the vertical is time. So you have 1 second, 1.5 seconds, 2 seconds, and you can right away see that the second one, which I think is Target, had the header come in early on. B&H then had most of the content come in next, and then you have Amazon and actually not Amazon. That's Target. Amazon is a little later, and then the top row is Walmart. Didn't have main content of Walmart didn't come until about 3.5 seconds. And again, this is lab testing, so this is just one hit to these sites. You can actually run 9 runs for each time, so you can say run each site 9 times, and then it takes the median of those 9 runs. But again, it's really, really helpful, more for business, but very helpful to display whether before and after on your own site or compared to competitors. Now, on the bottom of this is just the top part of the page. Underneath that, this is what would be right underneath that. So there are a couple settings here on top that are important and worth going over. That middle column towards the right, you can set each thumbnail. Do you want to see it for every half a second, which is the default, what that screenshot was, or you can actually pull it down to 0.1 seconds. So that would give you much more thumbnails, but give you a very detailed view on when pixels started coming into the page. There's also a button there on the left that says create video, and what it does is this right here. And before I go to the next slide and show you the video, so down here on the bottom it gives you the waterfall, but you just tested 5 sites, right? So what it does is you can slide those blue sliders over, and it overlays all the waterfalls one on top of another. Really, really interesting to see. So you can see where those long tasks are happening, where the JavaScript execution is happening on one site versus the next. This here is a GIF of how the video looks. This is not a 4 sites, it's just 2 sites and comparing them to each other. And you see right here, it starts at 0. And again, when you're displaying your site compared to a competitor, it's really nice when you can say yours comes in at X time and the other one not for another second after. Another very useful thing with web page test is create an account. You create an account, it'll save all your runs, and you can go back forever and dig those up and compare and look back at them. This is what a waterfall looks like, and each network call is another row, and then there's colors for the different types of sources of assets. You get images, you get JavaScript, you get HTML, and then there's a shade for downloading, a shade for parsing and building it out, and then it has vertical lines for the different points on the page, so on load, and then when content was visible, etc. But this is really the, like we say, the kishkas, the details of what you're going to dig in and look at and try to understand what you can change, what you can move around, and improve things on your site. So a couple of things that on the developer technical end of web page test that you can do, and this is really helpful. You can set custom user agents, you can set custom headers, you can inject scripts, you can store the HTML that comes back, you can block resources. So if you say, I have third-party resources on the bottom of my page, and I wonder what would happen if those don't load. Would my site be faster? Maybe the less CPU, and that would now allow the HTML to be parsed faster, maybe the JavaScript to be parsed faster. You can easily do that here and say, only load anything from bhphoto.com, or maybe don't load this and this website. So very helpful. One last slide on web page test. This is a plotted graph for a few different sites, a few different versions of a page. We were testing different things. You can put these in. They have a URL format where you put these in as parameters, and they'll give it back to you, and you can see right away how one or two or three would be doing better than the others. So moving along quickly, and David, if I got to stop, let me know. I'll try to be not more than another few minutes. So next step is, what do we do to improve? And, you know, we know where we stand. We know how to measure. How do we work on improvements? So this is, again, maybe what people would have wanted to hear more about, but I think it's really important to have the whole first part of the talk, and that's just to understand the background of speed and performance and how you approach it. And this is endless, by the way. This is just, you know, maybe 6 or 7 points here, but this is absolutely endless. So image, obviously, optimizing your images, compressing them properly, and then also having a tool where you can attach parameters to image URLs and it'll serve the right size for the right place on the site. Redirect. So again, if you go back to web page test and you have a redirect, you'll see right there that there's one row for the initial call, and then it's got to do a 301 to go to another URL, and that takes 100 milliseconds. And the same goes for DNS and SSL, by the way. That's almost, sometimes can be up to a quarter of a second. And we had an issue, not an issue, but it took, I forget, maybe 200 milliseconds for SSL and DNS, and we were able to bring that down. And what happens a lot of times with these little different components or parts of a site is that there's defaults set for all these tools. And you go with the CDN, and they just unplug the defaults, and I'll show you a couple examples. And those defaults are most of the time not the best for you. They're the best for them. And for example, let's say you have a security JavaScript that fires on your site, and that, you know, it just does like this fingerprinting, right? So for them, the quicker this JavaScript fires, the better. So they dump it in head, right? So you have your HTML, you have your head, they'll put it right in the top of the page. But guess what? That slows everything down by maybe a second or a second and a half. So you have to have a conversation, and that has to be balanced out. You know, another thing is images. We talk about images, setting maximum images with the UX team. So we have banners on the homepage. It used to be there was no limit. They would just put up these, you know, megabyte or larger homepage hero banners, and nobody looked, nobody cared. But once we had a conversation about it, we agreed on maximum. So desktop is up to 250K maybe, mobile's 80K, but there's numbers there and people pay attention to it. Again, a huge part of this is H1 and H2. That's maybe for most people, depending on their CDNs, but it's an important way to be able to speed your site up. Most of the time, if you go with HTTP2, more content will come over. You can look at resource fetching ahead of time, so things like preload, prefetch, and that does at least DNS prefetch. Will do some of the tasks it's doing earlier on and speed that process up. I'm almost done, David. So just want to show you guys a couple quick examples. So this, I guess, was maybe the green was time to first byte. And what happened was we have a service where our site, for A/B testing, we have a proxy server. So it goes to their server and then comes to us. And, you know, time to first byte is always whatever number it is. At one point, they were down, and suddenly we saw that time to first byte drop by 200 milliseconds. So you're like, hey, what's going on here? And again, there was a default setting that had been turned on years before, and nobody ever looked at it, and there's almost no way to know it exists. But when this happened, we were able to talk to them, had a conversation, they tweaked their settings, and then if you look here, sort of where that red arrow is, a little bit after that, you see the blue goes down, and that was that day when we made that change versus the day before, and we gained that 100 milliseconds that was unnecessary. They were able to improve. Something else is another point would be something like this, where we had, and again, I forget what metric this is. We had, again, a security third-party JavaScript on the site, and it calls them, and they, based on your settings, will return JavaScript that executes in a certain fashion, and there was a default. And we had a lot of back and forth, and there was a compromise. We were able to improve that where it didn't execute right away, and you had that metric come down. So this is RUM data. This is why RUM is important. It's expensive, but important. And that's pretty much it. I have the last slide is just some links and resources, a couple interesting books, some links. I'll be happy to put those in Slack afterwards. And that's pretty much it. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks.
Before we do breakout rooms, questions for Izzy?
You guys sharing the slideshow? I'd love to take a look at it.
I didn't think about it. I'd probably, sure.
Good question, Morty.
Thank you.
Shmuel Rosansky wants to know if you've looked at WebP format.
Yeah, we've looked at WebP. So right now those things are being set by CDN, and I'm pretty sure we are doing WebP. Again, I discussed this, but WebP I don't think it is works on Safari right now. We have a lot of Apple traffic, and a lot of these metrics coming from Google. One of the downsides, or not downsides, these are Chrome APIs, and you don't get good numbers coming out of Safari for them. So a lot of the people are trying to get Safari more involved and more up to date and in sync with Chrome, but WebP I think is only on Chrome, and I believe we optimize for WebP right now. Yeah, so yes.
Do you integrate these performance tests into your release pipeline, or are they done against the production code base?
So RUM is real user measurement. That's just coming back from all your any everyday traffic that you have. The synthetic, the lab testing, yeah, we kick off a set of tests when we migrate, and that way, if things change drastically, we can go back and reference that point. There's a note kept there, sort of. There's a vertical line saying this is when there was a migration. The other thing that's very typical of migrations is if you have performance budgets. So if you have a metric, or maybe your size, the content of your HTML or JavaScript is X amount of kilobytes, and you record that and have that as a budget, then you can, with every release or every commit, confirm that it hasn't gone over a certain number. We don't have that set up right now. It's something we'd love to do, but challenging to implement. And again, I just want to point out, this is, Google sort of takes your site and just says, okay, here's a number. But if you dig into it, every URL is different on your site. So you have your home page, a listing page, a detail page. Every single page is different. Many times different requirements, sometimes even different teams dictating what should be on the page as far as complexity and UX. So it gets nitty-gritty, it gets complicated, but it's important, and it's a good feeling when you bring numbers down and users can come and, wow, it's a really fast experience.
More questions?
Are there any security concerns with any of these tools?
Nope, not that I'm aware of. We have a very strict security team that vets everything. So RUM is not giving you any PPI? It's not sharing any of that back. We don't get any user information. So that's just saying, here's a user and here are the metrics that that they experience. And then for synthetic, again, you're just running your own site against a tool that's giving you some background, some information about it. There's no, you know what I mean? There's no code, there's no anything.
Which RUM do you guys use?
We use Catchpoint. It's expensive. RUM is not cheap. RUM is expensive.
I know.
Yep. That's why Crux is very successful. Chrome's public, which is in essence RUM from many Chrome users, is very, very popular because you get a lot of those numbers for free. But again, you have to query you have to use big data. It's expensive also, and you don't have as much flexibility with filtering the data. And you also, what you don't have is individual URLs. Right now, it's just per site, per domain. You can't break that down.
Okay, I want to publicly thank Izzy for a well-prepared, well-delivered, and extremely useful lightning talk. Thanks, Iz.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right. Our experiment last week was a resounding, unmitigated success. So we're, by popular demand, redoing it. We're doing 2 rounds of breakout rooms, 10 minutes each. And each will have a Spark question. So if everyone who absolutely no uncertain terms wants to bail, do so now before we do room assignments. But before you do, make sure to stick Tuesday 9 p.m. next week in your calendar and tell your friends.
If you can stay for one but not both, then you have to leave now. It's both or none.
No, you could do the first, and then if you have a terrible time, you can leave.
No, it's not a question of terrible time. It's just a question of the time constraint.
Yeah. No, 10 minutes, and then if you need to go, you can go.
Okay.
Okay. Amazing. So doing. People leaving. All right. Okay. Spark question for first round, lasting 10 minutes. Do you have either a success story or horror story, your pick, related to performance at your company or a project you're working on? Success story or horror story, I guess which one you pick will say something about you. And rooms.